One thing I'd like to say to the audience that's online, including all of you that are here right now, I think it was mostly the online folks, they had asked a few questions on the business side. Not only is this panel very adept on the technology, they still write code, they started out that way, but they've also been leaders in software security, both technical and operationally in their own right. And they'll talk a little more about that. But for sake of time, because we've got a lot of stuff we really want to talk to you about today, what we're going to do is I'm just going to show you who's who, match the names up with the face, and then you can look online because all the bios are out there for you to look at. So right here to my left is Damalari Fagbemi. We've worked together for quite a few years, so glad to have him on the panel. And then we have Jeff Koslow and Anmal Misra and Larry Monteroni. So the first question I'm going to ask, and it's a good thing we introduced Larry last because he's going to answer this first because he's got a lot of passion on this, but so does the whole panel, is fuzzing is still kind of that other tool that's out there. A lot of development teams don't want to use it. They know about the other tools. In fact, sometimes they know about fuzzing too, but they just don't want to use it. So maybe you can talk a little about why that is and what we can do about it as a community. But before I get to that, I got to tell you why I picked on Larry first for this question. Up until very recently, he didn't have fuzzing going on in his SDL or in his cycle or anything. And it wasn't until just a few months ago that he finally became a believer in fuzzing. So Larry, what I'd like to do is start the answer. Well, maybe.
I was always a believer. It's just a matter of, not get to it for 5 years, as Brooke said.
Yeah.
It took time to.
Good. Well, thanks for clarifying that. But I think the main thing I'd like you to answer is why was that? What things did you have that didn't really make you comfortable about fuzzing? And then what changed your mind? And then we'll go around and have the rest of the panel answer the same question.
Yeah, at the risk of sort of being a little too meta, I might be a little bit different background than some of the other folks up here. I'm a student of developer psychology and development team sociology, and how you get them to change their behavior so that you get the results that you want. So the SDLC is people doing things, right? So they have to do different things if you want to change in the SDLC. So this concept of the theory of constraints is that for any system that produces value, that has some output, all you should do is focus on the bottleneck in that system. And you shouldn't worry about the rest of the system. You should get rid of the bottleneck, optimize that part of it, put enough resources in it, smooth that flow enough that no longer becomes the bottleneck, then the bottleneck shifts to somewhere else in the system. So every project, every company, every app is different. So I can't make a general statement that all SDLCs, the bottleneck is this thing that I'm going to hint at in a second here. But for the vast majority of them at an enterprise where I was until recently, Comcast, the bottleneck was getting developers to actually respond to findings. It wasn't finding new things. We could build up piles of all these findings using all these tools. It was actually getting them to do something about it. And so the key that I learned, the trick that I used, the decision we made, the learning we got to eventually, is that we use the pull request as the one place where we provide feedback to developers, because developers are in love with the code they wrote this morning. It's their new heartthrob, right? They want nothing more than their friends on their team to say it's wonderful. And so if there's a feedback that comes and prevents that code from getting merged in, they're going to pay attention to it. They're going to do that micro learning. They're going to dig in deep. Now you can't flood them with 30,000 things there in the pull request. It's got to be one thing per thing. So up until recently, I didn't feel like fuzzing was a good fit for providing feedback in the pull request. And we found a mechanism that you could actually provide it in the pull request. And that's the key thing that got me over that hump of not being able to do it before, not being willing to do it before, because it wasn't the bottleneck. It wasn't going to help me with the bottleneck. And now it does help me with the bottleneck, because the results of a finding from a fuzzing tool are really much more significant than a SAS tool, which could be false positive, or even an IS tool, which could be a potential vulnerability. It's all about the bottleneck. It's all about getting the developer to do something. It's all about resolving the findings, not finding new things.
Good. Well, thanks, Larry. I think the audience will find that very useful. May come up and ask you some questions later on the process that you went through to make that decision. So, Anmol, how about you? What type of thoughts do you have on that topic of why people aren't accepting fuzzing as globally as they are with some of the other products that are out there that are used in the software development side of the house?
In addition to everything Larry said, I think within the security community itself, fuzzing is maybe not that well understood. It's a craft that comes when you practice, you're at the edge of your skill sets. So even within the security teams, fuzzing tends to come after SAST and DAST. And to me, that's one of that reflects how then developers, our community, looks at what we do in fuzzing, and that has started to change in the last 3-4 years maybe. But I do see that as another sort of bottleneck. Is within the security world, we need to make sure we are clear on why do we do static analysis and what do we really want to get out of it, because of false positives, and why are we doing fuzzing or other kinds of testing, complementing them, replacing them. This craft comes with practice time. I don't believe security teams across have that nailed down. And so I think it was Brooke who said, when you ask people to do fuzzing, they may just start tampering protocols with garbage, then we'll give them frustrating output. And that will in turn frustrate developers. And this cycle, then frustrate security teams. They don't want fuzzing because fuzzing is a craft where you need to spend time. Same goes for developers, right? You can't throw, if you ever run a fuzzing tool, it will give you an output. To tell that output and how it's working in the code base, you need to work with developer, help them understand it. And I think that's the other thing I see, which I think Larry mentioned, but building it on slightly.
All right, great, thanks. Do you have, before we move on from you, do you have any examples that you've had in either where you've worked or where you've seen somewhere else where they've actually had successes in that? And that goes for the rest of you as we get around to you to answer that question.
Sure. In my experience, the successes for fuzzing have come in when we have had developers or QA running fuzzing as a service. I think you enable them and they are autonomous. They don't rely on security team to do this for them. The other thing I've seen successful in my experience is sort of a fuzzing in a 3-tiered approach. Fuzzing that happens close to the QA cycle. I think it was David who mentioned negative testing around that. Then you have, at least in today's world, CI/CD, you don't first test everything that comes in every day. You do, maybe you figure out the mechanism, every sprint, every month, whatever is your goal. And then, of course, the pen test. I mean, that would be more of protocol fuzzing, black box towards the end. So making our stakeholders, empowering them is one, but also fuzzing in a 3-tiered approach.
Okay,
that's what I've seen to be successful.
Yeah, I guess one of the impediments that I can see is often the end goal. So you guys are all talking about, we have these things, we need to find the bottlenecks. You need to find the bottlenecks so the developers will actually solve the problem, but there's something just a little bit further away about a fuzz result output. Sometimes it ends up being a really cool thing, or we're really interested in it, and we dig down into it and we find something the compiler did funny, or we get into it and then we solve that problem. But a lot of times it's just, oh, gee, it's another, I should have checked for null right here. And that's an easy fix, but it's not, it doesn't connect, it doesn't grab some of the developers. And that's work that, frankly, I kind of want my tools to just make those go away and not have to see them. Spending a little bit of time on those, I think that's what is articulating the goal of what we want to get out of it for each individual developer. I've seen developers light up when they see a bug and they're like, oh, now I know how cross-site scripting works, and I will never write one of those again. They will, but they'll get into it and they understand it. And I love to see developers' eyes light up and like, I'm going to solve that problem and I'm going to keep doing that. Fuzzing feels to me like it's just a little teeny bit further away in many cases. I think there's ways to solve that. It's problem solving. Yeah.
Good. Thanks, Jeff. Kamalari, I know I've seen some of the challenges you face that you're probably going to talk about here next, but look forward to hearing what your thoughts are.
I'm Sam. I just wanted to say, how you guys doing? We really, really appreciate y'all. You could be anywhere else, but you're here, spending time with us. Thank you, really. So, to what my friends were saying earlier about fuzzing being other, as far as developers are concerned, the one word that came to my mind is accessibility. Fuzzing has got to be accessible to the folks if we expect developers to use it in terms of their mainstream process for development. So does it feed into the development flow? Does it fit into the CI/CD flow? Our software moves super fast these days. And also, even the results that come out of fuzzy, sometimes you need some sort of expertise and insight to understand what the operating system is spitting out. So, like you were saying, Jeff, are the tools smart enough to begin to tell us clearly what this bug means, such that you don't need, say, a PhD or years of pen testing experience to be able to analyze and triage that it's an actual issue. So maybe I could just leave that there for now.
Okay, good. That's good enough. All
James,
right, thank you.
One thing I want to add to what both of them said, fuzzing is a security, domain. You can use it at that, but it's a code quality thing too. And I think the success, and coming back to your question, that I seen earlier in my career on fuzzing was because it improved the code base, the code quality. If we keep emphasizing security as the only thing you get out of it, then I do think it then gets compared to the other tool sets that I think Brooke mentioned. And so the fuzzing is one place where I think we can emphasize you get better code quality for the less noise compared to static analysis.
Got it, thanks. Any other comments before we move on to the next question? Let me just clarify that, Damalari, was what you were saying that if you get all the PhDs out of the whole program, then the fuzzing runs better? Is that what you were saying?
That is not what I was saying.
All right, so another thing that we talk about a lot, and actually Brooke and I spent a lot of time in our last two books talking about, is the cultural changes that are required if you want to gain trust with your developers. Of course, most of you, I assume, in this audience are developers or managed developers, but if you don't earn their trust, you're going to go nowhere with your program, particularly a security program. And then there's the part of enabling secure software for the developers. Everybody starts with security first. It needs to start with development first and training your developers how to write secure code. One thing I said, because I've had 7 CISO, CSO tours over my corporate career, and I've spent the last 10 or 11 totally focused on what's now called the Chief Product Security Officer, but essentially whoever the senior management person is in the software team. They don't report to the CISO, and I have a really big, a large opinion on not having that role report to the CISO. And Brooke and I talk a little more about that on the book. Let me get back to the panel, but that's one of the reasons I wanted to ask this question is, what is it going to take to actually change that culture? Because you guys can read about what Brooke and I said, but everybody's different. And one thing we found out, one size doesn't fit all with any of this. And Larry, I've heard you talk so many times in so many videos I've seen online, you get quite candid with it. So I'm going to go back to you for this one, just to start first.
I get to start twice. So yeah, that's it for me for the rest of the panel.
Yeah, we're not going to talk to you anymore.
Yeah. So this is what I focus most of my learning on. And it's interesting, I use the word my learning, but really, and Brooke hinted at this earlier, is that it's all about feedback providing learning. So there's this this study, this sort of discipline of teaching that is, about teaching kids in school, a lot of the research that has gone into this. But they talk about this thing called contextual learning. And there's 3 aspects of contextual learning. There's the personal aspect. Is this important to what I want to get done today? Is the thing I need to learn about going to help me accomplish the task I'm trying to get done today? For instance, I got a finding in my pull request that said I had an SQL injection bug. I need to go learn about what an SQL injection vulnerability is. So it's important to me personally because I'm trying to get that code shipped. Is it important to me socially? Does it give me cred with my peers? So, in school, you want to, be good. So that's why it was tough to get women to do STEM jobs, is because it didn't get them cred with their peers. And so it was a difficult thing. It was missing that part the concept of contextual learning. And then the third aspect is organizational, structural, they call it. And it doesn't translate directly to the sort of developer and enterprise world very much, but I have translated it to mean, does the thing you're learning about align with organizational priorities? And so when you have all three of these things are true, you're in this hedgehog. It's like a Venn diagram where the middle is like that rounded off triangle there. That's the shape of a hedgehog's head. That's the hedgehog of learning. And so if you design all of your behavior change system, all of your cultural change system, all of your mindset change system to fall into that hedgehog, then you get this very incremental approach to getting people to change that really builds momentum and takes off and spreads throughout the organization. So designing the rollout process of the secure SDLC is just as important as the design of the secure SDLC itself. In fact, I would argue it's more important. And you actually change the design of the secure SDLC if you take into account this rollout, this adoption aspect as the primary thing you have to focus on.
Great, thanks, Larry. Damilare, let's go over to you on that particular topic. And what do you think? I know you've had some interesting struggles on the cultural side of changes that needed to happen within the groups you've reported into to make sure that the developers were, number one, trained right, they knew what it was, and also empowerment. I think that's the big word, is empowering developers to do the job, do the security job. As you've heard me say a million times, it's a lot easier to train a developer to be a security expert than a so-called security expert to be a developer. There's some exceptions to that, I know, and I'm sure some people in the audience could correct me on that. But in general, I think that's something that's true.
I agree with you. And when I think about that, I'm thinking three things come to mind with regards to, say, security expertise. And we're talking about developers producing, working code, and all the other stuff that's going on with, in fact, I've had Brooke say quite often that sometimes software development is the modern day factory line, in a sense. There's always features to release. There are always new products. There are always new releases, and there's a lot of pressure. So that being said, when we think about hacking culture, essentially, I think about, for starters, the word awareness. Is there just enough understanding of what the goal of the organization is as far as the security program is concerned, and how specific tools or techniques like fuzzing feed into that program? So that's awareness, training, things like that. The second thing that comes to my mind is partnership. Really, partnership between developers and the security experts. Now, we want developers to write secure code, and we could talk about that all day long. But the truth is, we don't expect every developer to be a cryptographer, for instance. So there are some people who have some particular expertise concerning the SDL or some sections of the SDL, but there should be a partnership between those experts, enabling and empowering the developers that they're working with. And then the third word that comes to me from what you said, empowerment, is support. The security organization is there to support the development organization, to support the developers, to help them get to where the organization is trying to get to, which is really just to protect customers, protect the business, and really boost customer trust via secure software.
Thanks, Damilare. Jeff.
Those were two really good answers, and I wish I had a hedgehog metaphor and a tick off on my fingers. My thoughts revolve around this, build the culture of security is kind of security is everyone's job, but I really fear that as a statement, because then it becomes nobody's job and everybody thinks somebody else is going to do it. So I've had a long and storied past on this, trying to get people to. We've talked about champions before, and all these, and how you can build up that expertise in different areas, but then make sure that it's spread throughout the organization. And it comes down to organizational goals. Absolutely, the organization's goals should be delivering high quality software with security features built into it. So it's a long and hard job to do, building it into your, a clear, coherent. I really like the idea of a clear, coherent, secure software development lifecycle that has the right incentives built into it, because that's where we often go wrong. You're correct, and we do often say the features are the most important thing in the software, and of course that's not true, and everybody knows that. but yet what are the things we're measuring? The things we're measuring are the things we get better at. So we end up delivering more and more and more features until it becomes something that we can't sustain the feature load because we've got other things to do.
Good, thanks, Jeff. Amal, you, I, and Brooke wrote, I think, the first book that was out there on the importance of the human element in software development. I think there was lots of books on that for the InfoSec side that came out before, but I don't recall another one. So what are your thoughts on this topic? And what's been success? I know you've done a lot of work making this a success in the last couple of years from the lessons learned in the past.
One thing I'm all for making sure we have champions program, we do education awareness. I think that's absolutely needed. Having said that, I don't think we can train our way out of this problem. There is no way. I think Brooke said 28 million programs. I want you to think about how many lines of code are being added every single day. Now think of a developer. When you check in code, I want to train you with top 10 of OWASP, the other attack types, so that when you check in code, we don't have to worry about it. I'm not sure that is a workable, scalable model in the long term. As much as we should make folks aware and educate and go down that path, autonomous systems, doing this through automation probably is the way we will solve it in the long term.
Got it. I think, Larry, you've got another comment.
Yeah,
on it.
I love that, and it builds on what Brooke was saying too. Is that I did a study. I published my talk at the RSA conference in 2020 was an analysis of the elements of the R program at Comcast correlated with risk reduction outcomes. And the biggest surprise of our finding is that the folks that had more training on their team, the folks that went through the 40-hour version of our Greenbelt program instead of the 2.5-hour version of our just minimal secure coding training program, they actually had worse security outcomes. And you think, well, that training is not bad, but so there was a selection bias was the reason that they had worse security outcomes. We went and asked the teams. They're like, "Why did you send Joe to?" Well, Joe's not a very good programmer, so we sent him off to that training because somebody had to do it. So that's not going to have a big influence on the team. But I mean, if you poke at this hard, the champion program was another one that was way underperforming the investment we'd put in it. The training program was way underperforming. We switched completely to this incremental, just-in-time, get the hedgehog, make sure it's important to the task. You don't give them a secure coding class. Give them a 2 to 3 minute video and attack response class that only gets prompted at the moment that the tool feedback tells them they have an SQL injection vulnerability.
I think one of the things that happened on one of the
Who's
teams.
that clapping over there? I got to pay you later. So.
Oh, that was Brooke. Just ignore
Oh,
it.
that was Brooke. Yeah, we got a love fest going here. So, yeah.
So one of the things.
Everyone else needs to be paid because you were clapping too, right? So we'll form a line later.
Speaking of Brooke, one of the things that we saw that I considered success of one of the programs that we were managing was that when you have the teams actually come back and tell you, "We got it, your oversight, go away, we know how to train our folks, we know how to do this," and part of it was what you were just talking about. They started, there's a lot of good training vendors out there. I assume there's none out here, but if you are, apologize. Their programs can get better. They're good for basic, but then what do you do after that? And so they have, especially the environment we were in, had so many different things that were interconnected in the cloud and everywhere else that they started doing their own 15-minute TED type talks. And it really improved our program. And then everybody wanted to be a security champion, and we had to turn people away. So that's, I think, when you know you've actually arrived. And somebody else was going to make a comment before we moved on to.
Yeah, I was thinking just about that. Most recently, I began to wonder, what does it look like around all these topics of security training to have really clear and concise content? Video format, it's interesting to hear you just talk about that because there's so much training out there, and we know how overwhelming that can be for people just getting this check boxes, if you will, of training. How do we so I recently found myself thinking about those short videos, 5 minutes, 6 minutes. So it's still an experiment I'm working with. So it's interesting to hear you talk about the success you've had there.
There are some vendors that specialize in this. I was just on a video interview with one of them, and their product fits perfectly with this model. There's at least two vendors I know where their model fits really well with this.
Yeah, they're really, I think they're listening to their customers now because it is a niche market somewhat, but I think it's getting bigger. As Brooke said earlier, with the amount of developers out there, that's a pretty big market to go after. So the next thing I'd like to talk about, move away from kind of the operational side and how you grow your teams and stuff, move on more on the nitty gritty of fuzzing. So there's been a lot of talk in the community, and I think I've heard some of you guys talk about it too. There's, to be really frank, there's limitations in a lot of the modern fuzzing tools. So I'd like you guys to be pretty candid on what you're seeing out there and what you think needs to be improved. So Damalari, we'll start with you on that question.
Sure. Something that comes to mind right away with some of the fuzzers I've seen recently, some of them have a cult following, and there's nothing wrong with a cult following, but sometimes you have that cult following because they only work in limited environments. So this particular tool works best or only works on Linux, or this particular tool only works on Windows. And of course, these days, most people are trying to develop cross-platform software. So you have a tool that it can only work on a particular platform, except you do some gymnastics like you're in the Olympics. That becomes a problem for people to actually adopt such a tool. Another thought in my head has to do with even what you can fuzz. Some tools, it's specific to, okay, I can fuzz this kind of file or this kind of document or this kind of data buffer, and that it doesn't scale well across the different kind of inputs that most of this complex software, like Brooke was saying earlier, involve, and the different kinds of interfaces or inputs that they take. So the specificity to just one type of input type is also a limitation. Another thing is the time. For instance, the time it takes to run a fuzzer. It could take, in some cases, some tools I've seen, it takes days to get a good fuzz run. And when you think, once again, software development moving so fast, people trying to release continuously, a fuzzing tool that takes days can be a concern. Then the expertise I mentioned earlier, the expertise it takes to analyze the results and understand it, it can be a lot more accessible to folks if it's just clear and more obvious what an error means and what can be done about it.
Great, thanks, Damalari. Jeff, what about you?
I spend a lot of time thinking about fuzzing of network protocols, and network protocols there's some problems there that usually have to do with some protocols are stateless, some protocols are stateful. I worry about fuzzing going into the state of things and keeping track of the state of a conversation. And so those are the sorts of things that appears very, very tactical to me and not strategic. It's like, let's work on these sorts of problems and see if we can't get a little bit deeper into them. And I think that's within reach. I think the other thing that made me think about this a while ago was when I started fuzzing a long time ago, when we started talking about limitations, it occurs to me that I used to tell my kids would ask me a question like, well, how does that work? Or what is that? And I would always kind of say, gee, it's too bad we don't have like an information retrieval device where we could go out and find the answer to that question. I guess we'll never know. And so it occurred to me that some of the limitations of fuzzing years ago was just, I need a whole lot of compute and I need it on demand and I want to push a button and make it happen. Clearly somebody invented a cloud, and so we sort of got past that. But now we've got a green field, and now putting things into that and enhancing that, I guess, is where my thoughts lead on that one.
Good, thanks, Jeff. Alma.
Yeah, I think they've covered for most part. One thing I'll say, as fuzzing has evolved, so has the threat landscape. So have we kept up the fuzzing techniques in a scalable manner for cloud in production systems, where you have integrations of APIs coming in, you have microservices rolling out, and so everything we talked about for the last half an hour, I think those boundary conditions change, and so I don't think we have a good answer on how to do that scale in the cloud. That would be one limitation. I see that right off the bat. The other one, of course, that at least early on in my career, I made a mistake of fuzzing program. I think the first few months are probably the most critical. It's the setup that requires and the credibility you bring with your first few scan results. And that's where, again, for all the reasons, right? You may be fuzzing the wrong thing. You may end up fuzzing a protocol when you need to fuzz a file format. Those kind of mistakes eventually then will derail you with our developer community.
Well, you brought up APIs. So as you guys talk back and forth here, I'd love for you to start talking about that in relation to it because it's somewhat related. But go ahead, Jeff.
But all I was going to say was organizational goals. Sometimes you end up getting a developer and they're like, I read about this new Fuzzatron 3000 and I'm going to spend some time on it. And as leaders, we want to say, great, tell me what the results are and let's go further with that. But I don't think that's enough. I think that's a start. But then developers might go into the weeds, just maybe, right? And so steering them back online and making sure that we've got the goals of the project in mind. And I've seen that success before, but it does take steering.
It takes steering, it takes hand holding essentially till the end, at least for
exactly.
the first few times, till it becomes a muscle.
Muscle memory, yeah, that's a good way to say it. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Larry, go.
I think my peers up here pointed out a lot of the problems. One of them was the speed of the fuzzing, and so I want to take an opportunity to sort of, it's not actually a solution, but it's sort of like the early thinking of a possible solution to one of the difficulties with fuzzing. So speed, how long it takes to get results. So think about the responsiveness of a UI. You could make the backend be so fast that it feels really responsive to the user. Or you could cheat and you could basically take his input and respond to it like it was a successful save and pretend like it was, then go and slowly do the round trip to the server and all of its other API calls and all of its other microservices. And only if that fails do you come back and actually change what happened in the user's UI. So the apparent responsiveness, the apparent speed of the system is very different than the actual speed of the system. Well, what would that look like for fuzzing? And this is only half-baked, but I've been exploring these possibilities over here. So don't try to do a fuzzing set and get all of the findings. Wait till it's all done. And don't actually, even if you do have a bunch of findings, let's say you have 30 of them from a fuzzing run, don't give all of them to the developer immediately. Wait until the developer is working in that part of the code and only put it as feedback to the pull request that he submitted this morning to try to get accepted, because it's related to that part of the code. It'll look like to him it's responsiveness to something that he was just working on this morning, when in reality it was something that ran for days in the background and just pieced together. I don't know if that's going to work. Maybe David could comment. I'd love to sort of hear some other folks who've thought more about this, and whether or not that would really work.
I worry about that a little bit.
Okay.
It's almost unfair. I didn't make a change to that particular. I made a change to that line, but I'm not changing the functionality. And now this thing is popping up and telling me that I have to do something about it.
But it's in the way of me getting my code merged. So even if it isn't my direct fault, I might still be willing to put a little more effort into paying.
I agree.
To it.
Most developers want to do exactly the right thing, but if it's a critical path and it needs to be done, and their boss is on their back, that's one more thing for them to do. So.
Well,
I like the idea.
Oh, are you done?
I'm done.
Okay. So that's the question of risk. I wonder about that. So we found this thing while fuzzing, in the back end, so to speak, and now we just hold it for a while before sharing it. So what if that person is not writing that? And I know you're thinking through it, right? So not to just bounce on you. What if now the developer hasn't worked on that piece of code for months, and maybe it's high risk or high severity? Would you just skip it there? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, maybe there's two loops. Maybe there's the traditional, put it in your JIRA backlog, the list of findings, and that's the sort of slower, less immediate loop. And this is sort of the faster sort of,
So keep going on that. And I think, Jeff, you were going to say something. But I'd also like you guys to touch on, because we talked about it when Brooke was talking up here about APIs. I think it'd be really great if some fuzzing company came up with a good API solution for all of us, because I hear that out in the field all the time. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, you think it's a great thing? Or?
Who are you starting with?
Jeff, yeah.
Oh, I when I look at something like that and I look at the sheer number of APIs that are out there, multiplied times the considerably number of possible flaws that are in there, compared with, or in addition to the complexity and the contractuals that I have. I can't change my APIs. I can't do all these things, and the state of the current art against APIs, I would say that's probably one of my top concerns. And I have been unable to find anything that makes me feel comfortable going through this. And so that's one of my projects. And I don't have any success to show on that. So I'm not sure I can go a whole lot
Okay.
further. When I think about the big problems, that one's on my list.
Got it. Anybody else have anything to add on that from an API standpoint? Well, maybe one of the for all secure speakers that comes up after me can talk about that. All right, so let's move on to scaling. What are all of, I'm thinking out here, if you have questions on that, or when you start hearing what their solutions are, that's a big challenge in the community right now. And how are you guys successfully going after scaling your fuzzing implementation? So Jeff, we're going to start with you this time.
So it occurred to me that, gee, if only somebody built a giant data center full of compute that I could throw things into. Of course, that's been done. And that's now, there's at least one Google project that we were talking about, and there was an Azure project where you could throw things in there. Where I'd like that to go for scaling is, my shop is a Unix shop with a bunch of independent developers who like to do their own thing. And a few years ago, we had VI and Emacs and Notepad or something like that. And I've been really shocked to see how much Visual Studio Code has just become the editor that everybody uses. And it's because the tools that got put into it. Everybody can start this up if you prefer to edit over SSH, if you prefer to do this way, if you prefer a headless, no matter how you do it, you're getting the code in. And I feel like that's kind of the next thing that we need to do to get this to scale out, is that same tool. So for those vendors listening, where's my Visual Studio Code plugin? I don't even know what that looks like, but when I push a button and it gets automatically fuzzed and it's right in there, to me that's something that would be just incredible.
Got it. Larry?
I'm going to pass on this one.
Okay. Damalari.
Yeah, so as you said that, I was just smiling because sometimes this is why it's so cool to ask questions of folks who might not be in the security space or maybe writing as much code as some of us do. Because I was talking to my wife about this earlier, and we're talking about, fuzzing given this conference. And she asked a question. She said, what about the IDE? Because what she does is user interface design and user experience design. She's thinking about the experience for developers. What about the IDE? What does that look like? And I said, well, I don't know. I don't know about that. So that is interesting in terms of, but as you say that I see that as a future possibility, because now you have tools like Visual Studio having static analysis tools that are getting stronger. What does it look like to have fuzzing tools that are right there in the IDE as well? And then the second thing that comes to mind is fuzzing as a service. And we talked about some of this open source tools these days that you have just a large infrastructure. Currently, open source tools can supply themselves to this Google OSS fuzz, and you just get fuzzed for free. So I can imagine that even happening within companies as well, because if you think about it with even CI/CD, you rarely need each team to go develop their own CI/CD engine or platform. So they share one. So I wonder what it looks like to have fuzzers as a service, such that across a department or across an organization or across swaths of the industry, software can get fuzzed.
Great. Thanks for that input. Amal.
Nothing to add.
Okay, good, because you got the next question. So one of the things, and I know you've been working a lot in cloud and other extended environments. What are your thoughts of the relevancy of fuzzing within a cloud environment or CI/CD environment or any of the other things that are challenging folks right now?
It's very relevant. Knowing that you're doing fuzzing at the right points. And again, I think I mentioned earlier, you have the earlier phase near negative testing with developers. And then you want to figure out where do you do the testing after the deployment. but the relevance comes in just because we have so much code being shipped from left to right, but also from right to left. And tell me, I mean, if our hope is the vendor I'm integrating my code with in production has run fuzzing on their end, I'm not sure that's the best strategy. Again, I don't think we have all the answers. We have solved compute problem for now, but we don't have the tool sets that can do this for a company that that writes very different kind of software, at least in the world that I worked in. That to me is one of the challenges that uh, that that we haven't solved, but I do think that makes it an important focus area going forward.
Okay, good thing. Larry.
Yeah, so we've solved the compute problem with cloud, and you can spin up a bunch of stuff in parallel and have it run. But that's expensive. I mean, if you're doing that for a really short period of time for a single Google query, right? Google search, then it's a small fraction each one. But if you have to run it for hours or days and you spin up a lot of it can get very expensive. So I think that falls down on Brooks' affordable dimension characteristic that he mentioned, possibly. So I don't know what the answer is to that, but and maybe that's not true. Maybe it doesn't take as much compute resources or isn't as costly as I think they are. But right now I worry about scaling just by throwing a bunch of cloud resources out of it.
Got it. Thanks, Larry. We've got about, go ahead.
Especially because at times fuzzing does give you false positives. So let's not forget about it, right? In some sense, you may find later on as you do investigations that was not the case. And so if you keep doing expensive compute with some of this testing, then you do run into how do you fund it?
Can you give me an example of the false positive? Is it like a defense in depth kind of thing?
It is defense in that you don't
Got
know
it,
exactly
okay.
where in the
Right.
code this is coming from. Now you go to development and say, I know how this works here, but then there's the stuff in the back logic that you may not be able to get through the fuzzing. Not at least in the production environments.
Got it.
Well,
So-
this has been a great discussion. I hate to cut this off here, but you can continue it on if we get any questions online. Now it's time to move on to the Q&A.
Yeah, I think I'd like to, I guess, echo. I'm not sure I agree with the it does have false positives. Like at least when we designed ours, right? Like there's an input that triggers the bug, and the developer has said this is how we run it in a way that matters. I don't see how you can say if someone is saying this is how we run the code in a way that matters, and by the way, this is going to trigger a fault, that's a false positive. So
false positive in the sense that when we are saying it's a security risk, there are other ways in that code base works that mitigates that risk. That's at least one thing I've seen is even though
that would prevent it from showing up if it was another code base mitigant. What I was thinking you were saying is that there was a sort of a network layer or environment layer.
Environment different. So
the production environment is different,
memory,
and the testing environment is then the testing environment. And
that's not a false positive. It sounds like
I agree.
It sounds like you have a band-aid around the solution. You're expecting the band-aid to never be penetrated.
Yeah, exactly.
I agree, but I think from a developer's perspective, the finding is coming to you from a setup that you have built. And that's really what my point was, is sometimes security does take stuff back to developers that we are not able to fully validate all the time.
I respect that, but that's kind of like saying, hey, I have ASLR turned on, therefore that's not exploitable. That's absolutely not what ASLR says. It just says it's harder.
Yeah, but my point is you have to go and have those conversations for the fuzzing findings as well.
Maybe it's a semantic thing of the definition of false positive here.
Yeah, I feel it's conflicting. Like static analysis has false positives, can't actually run the code. I said static analysis, the notion of a false positive there is it's never running the code. You can't show that you can even trigger that line of code. Here you're saying, given the developer configured the app so it's running in this way, given you triggered the bug, but we're still going to call it a false positive. I think it's really hard to have a straight face to your manager to say, and it doesn't matter then, compared to like an SBOM, for example, where the developer's like, yeah, that's out of date, but it's not on the attack surface. And by the way, it's stable. I mean, here, it's quite different.
I agree with that.
Any other comments before we move on to another question?
I have just, it's been in the back of my head that the cost of this, I don't have this in my head, but the compute cycles that we're running, is that cheaper in a cost per bug? And I don't know if anyone's done a study on that, right? Maybe I should be throwing everything at fuzzing. Maybe that's still cheaper than, what is a $50,000 machine to rig or something? Do you have any numbers on that?
I don't think people make or businesses make have purely rational decision making like the sort of model you're talking about there. I think in general, you basically say we have X dollars to spend. It might not be enough to actually prevent us from getting attacked to the point where we don't lose more than that in market cap, but that's all we've got this year to spend. And so we're going to look for the things that give me the most value for the least cost, and we're going to just pick those. Or if that's actually a good model when that happens, what I find is a lot of people are just happy with saying, well, I did good things with that money, and neglect that they have a duty to have done the most valuable things with that money, not just some good things. And I think you get this path of least resistance sort of, we did good things with that money.
Fair enough. Yeah,
mindset.
I would like to quantify everything I do and stack rank them, but maybe it is better to.
No, I'm not saying
an
what I
intern.
said is better. I'm just saying it's what happens. You know?
Yeah.
I think your way is better, actually. Yeah.
And really quickly, just to your point, David, with animals, with false positives, there are some tools that give a score, for instance, about exploitability with regards to a particular fuzzing issue found, and they're not really, when you look at it with development team, it's not really exploitable like the tool says. So perhaps the tool that you're developing and you've been working on does not do that, which is great, but I think there are tools out there that still give some false positives.
Fuzzing tools that still give false positives?
Yeah, I believe so.
Huh.
At least in terms of, and even maybe in terms of the exploitability metric, is this exploitable or not? Or sometimes it may be exploitable, so it's not always exact with some tools.
All right, great discussion, folks. I think we're going to move on to an online.
Yes, because
Question.
we have lots of virtual questions now since you guys are so intriguing. So the first one is, everyone talks about teaching devs to code secure, but the devs leave that to the QA to find and complain about. But even after the product is released, external researchers fuzz and find vulns. So should we have QA do enough fuzzing, or have the dev cover maximum edge cases for inputs?
Can you say that again?
Do you want me to read that again? Yes, okay. Everyone talks about teaching devs to code secure, but the devs leave that to the QA to find and complain about. But even after the product is released, external researchers fuzz and find vulns. So should we have QA do enough fuzzing, or have the devs cover maximum edge cases for inputs?
It's an interesting question because, from my perspective, QA is going away in the future. It's becoming a different animal.
Yeah.
It's becoming, you want privacy, you want security, you want all that. It should be part of developing good code. It shouldn't be security department, it shouldn't be the privacy department. QA should be there. You still need a third party because you don't want but what do you guys think?
Yeah, I totally agree with that statement. I got up on stage 15 years ago at the beginning of the Agile movement, or not the beginning, but early stages of the Agile movement. And I said, QA departments, QA folks in the audience, the Agile team, the development team is supposed to own the quality of their product. They're supposed to own a lot of the product decision making of their product in an Agile world. Your world is changing. You better get used to it now. And I would leave stage, and all the QA people in the audience would flood me and find me out in the hallway and say, I hear what you're saying in an ideal world, but the developers at my company, we could never trust them with the quality of their own products. And, but that was really just a matter of them not being empowered and coached to be worthy of being trusted with it. And it's a little bit of a fake it till you make it. So the Agile movement spread the development team's domain a little bit to the right with QA and a little bit to the left with product. And then the DevOps movement spread it a little bit further to the right with ops. And I think the DevSecOps movement sort of includes that and pulls those folks on. So I'm not relying upon QA, or even I don't even want to rely on security to be to be a factor in development teams putting out high quality products that have no vulnerabilities.
Okay, we're gonna probably stop there to get to another question.
So,
if you don't
okay,
mind.
so
Yeah.
the second question is, what is an example of the best fuzzing and worst fuzzing implementation in 2020 through 2021, aka now? Did they stump you?
It's a great question. And nobody wants to talk about their epic failures,
Of
right?
course not.
Can you read that one more time?
Of course. So, what is an example of the best fuzzing and worst fuzzing implementations? I'll say as of late.
So I'm gonna just either throw this over to Jeff if he wants it, or just borrow what he said earlier. You know that a lot of times the state that you have to get to the really interesting problems is difficult to reproduce and to get there. And throwing a tool at it without the guidance or without its ability to figure out what state really gets you to the interesting places, those are failures. That's just throwing money away, in my opinion. And I've seen that most of the time with fuzzing implementations.
Yeah, and
Is that you agree with that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I want to go too much further into this question because
Okay.
Well,
I'm not. Yeah.
since you guys all looked at me to take the heat on it, I'll go ahead and the one thing I would say, and I won't get into too many particulars, but there's been some very large cases that have affected some very large organizations, both private and public, in the last year or two, particularly the last 6 months. I think fuzzing would have helped tremendously in that. The successes, unfortunately, you're not going to hear about because they did their job well and they want to keep it secret that, oh, we found this. So it's a two-edged sword, but it's a good one for fuzzing.
Yes.
Because it sells well because of what it can do. It's not the final answer, but it's one of the big answers. And so that's my opinion without naming any names.
Yeah.
And I've got to jump in there quickly. When I say what comes to my mind with one of the best implementations recently, positive services that allow any open source software team to get fuzzed. You're beginning to have some of those in the industry whereby you've got an open source tool, it's free, supply to the service, and you'll get fuzzed. And perhaps one of the not so great implementations that I still see from time to time is an executable file that is able to fuzz PDFs, for instance. And so the development team just clicks this Windows executable and tries to fuzz the file input. And that doesn't scale, and it's maybe an old tool that is not maintained anymore, but that's what the team knows about. So that's one example that I've still seen.
Good, thanks, Tom and Laurie. I think we'll move on just to. Oh, okay. I think we'll move on just to get through the rest of this.
So there is another question, but it speaks to QA and dev, but we kind of touched on it. But I'm going to add my little twist to it. So in an organization, who needs to perform fuzz testing? Is it, well, the original question is the QA or the developers? But I think this is an interesting one because we see this all the time. So who can fuzz test in an organization?
Well, a computer is doing the fuzz testing.
Well, yes, Larry, I know that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a matter of who kicks it off.
So who owns it, right?
Who owns it?
Right.
Yeah, exactly,
Yes.
exactly. Yeah. So yeah.
Is it the security team? Is it the developers?
I think it's moving away from that. You'll
Mhm.
see if you go to the biggest, this is for all of you in the audience that have been, especially if you have a few years in now, there's somewhat of a new term called the computer, or not computer, no, I can't remember the name of anyway, there's a security officer for development now that's out there, and it's the chief product security officer. And it doesn't matter whether you have the name. The same thing happened back in the days where, like when I was a CISO, you didn't have the CISO titles in. I'm dating myself, but you go back there. But CPSO, it should, and that belongs in engineering, and they're recruiting for that now. Some of the biggest organizations in the world are looking for people they're calling CPSOs. And when I say that, you say, well, the name doesn't mean anything. The name means something because it belongs in engineering. So to answer your question, engineering should own and development should own fuzzing. You may have some audit functions that come in and do that, but you guys disagree with any other? Yeah,
I think engineering should kick it off, but I think that the security organization or the security budget, at least, should pay for the licenses and the computer research. And
I
so,
see that typically.
so
happen.
that's why I was going to poke it owns sort of this two aspects of it, and I think that you still engineers are notoriously bad about paying for tools, right? I mean, Visual Studio Code is essentially a perfect example of Microsoft disrupting their own IDE business. You know, they gave it away for free, and that's because they recognize that developers will take a tool that's 80% as good as one they have to pay for, and they'll take the free one. So they are not used to paying big budgets, but security folks are used to paying. Security budgets are used to paying for tooling and the value of this, and so
That's been my challenge in those roles. However, because I was a CISO before and a CSO, we figured out ways to do it. In engineering now, would rather own that as well.
own the budget of it.
Yeah, I've seen that happen. It's not very
Nice.
common. It's an art to get that happen, but it is happening. And part of that is if they're going to assume the responsibility, they assume the budget as well. It becomes kind of cost of goods sold, so to speak. I've had some security teams, and Amal, you were with me when we did that, pulled that off. We actually went cost of goods sold for the security being built in, and all of a sudden you solve that other problem. But I know that majority of people don't do that yet, but it is an alternative that can be done. Otherwise, you have this fight between security and development. Anyway, back to.
So we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Does our in-person audience have any?
This one over here.
Have more of a, I guess, a comment. I think that the answer to that question is that, you know, whoever should own it should be whoever's early in the life cycle, right? Because we all know that fuzzing is an amazing thing that needs to be done, right? But if you have security own it, they do it typically later in the life cycle. The earlier that you do it, particularly in the engineering, you know, the earlier you're finding it, the cheaper it is to, you know, maintain or update the code that needs to be done. So I think that the answer should always be, you know, whoever's further left in the software development lifecycle. You know, we should be pushing left all of these things so that we can kind of reduce the cost of, you know, ownership and maintaining over the course of the, you know, the life cycle.
I think that's an excellent point. One thing we didn't talk about today was PCERT, because we're talking about fuzzing, but it's related to that. You shouldn't be doing your PCERT shouldn't be the first time they're actually using the fuzzing tool. That you've already failed miserably. Any comments on what she just said? I don't know that any of you disagree with that.
I
'cause that's
agree.
Yeah.
I agree, and I was thinking that similarly the team. So we talk about QA, or is it the developers and who pays for it? And yeah, engineering could pay for it, or the security office could pay for it, but the team, whatever that means, the team should be doing fuzzing.
Good. Well, I think that's it. Oh, well, one more. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. So when you're deploying this with the development team for the first time, the question is going to be asked: how long, how much, and how deep? I guess that's the question, and I know it's kind of a broad question, but how do you tackle that?
Oh, can you state the question again? I didn't.
When you deploy like the fuzzing system for the first time program, the development team is going to ask, how long do you want us to run these tests for, and how deep, or what do you want us to do? How do you usually answer that question?
Until you found all the bugs.
No, I don't think that. Well, I say, how much money are you willing to allocate to it and run it that much? How much percentage of your spend are you willing to allocate to it and run it that much so that you spend that amount? I think that's the way it's got to be, really, because there's so much value. Now, hopefully, the fuzzing tool you have finds the most critical ones first, but in all likelihood, they're not going to find the absolute most critical ones first. But yeah.
So my response, in addition to what my friends have said, is coverage, code coverage. So coverage-guided fuzzers give you a sense of whether you've explored enough of the code paths, or in fact, all of the code paths, given a particular input. So when you have getting to 100% code coverage with some fuzz testing corpus or set of data, I think that's a good metric, so to speak, to use in tandem with, are we not finding any issues any longer?
I'll just add one thing to that, is how much of what you find are you willing to fix? I think to me, that is one of the essential way of you look, how much to fuzz and how long? Well, will you fix it, or I'll get another 100,000 issues that you will not fix?
Yeah,
that, again,
I love
to me, is a critical aspect of how far you do it.
Thanks everybody for attending. This has been awesome. I appreciate all you and look forward to talking to all of you later. And we can talk about the ransomware thing he alluded to later as well.